Good evening and welcome back to the channel. This is our 5th episode. Part 5, Marine Helicopters at Soc Trang. What you're about to hear is drawn directly from the official history of the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam, a 9-volume series researched and written by the Marine Corps History and Museums Division and published by the U.S. government. These aren't dramatizations or second-hand accounts. This is the Corps' own record of what happened, compiled from command diaries, after-action reports, oral histories, and the accounts of the men who were there. We'll be focusing on the years when Marine involvement was most intense, the advisory era of the early 1960s, the landing at Da Nang in 1965, the brutal fighting of 1966 and 1967, and the defining crucible of 1968. We'll follow Marines from the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta to the hills above Khe Sanh. Where possible, we will go into detail on specific actions and include additional references for you to dive deeper into this history. As always, if this content is to your liking, please ensure that you like and subscribe. The language is formal, the record is honest, and the story is remarkable. Let's begin. Part 5, Marine Helicopters at Soc Trang. The Amphibious Ready Group TG 76.5 steamed from Okinawa on 10 April with HMM 362, its reinforcements, and HMM 261 embarked on the USS Princeton. The task group arrived off the coast of South Vietnam in the early morning hours of 15 April. At dawn, Lieutenant Colonel Clapp, who had seen action as a fighter pilot during the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns in World War II, led the first flight of helicopters from the deck of the Princeton. The operation proceeded smoothly, with aircraft from both squadrons ferrying HMM 362's equipment inland to the Soc Trang airstrip. Far out at sea, jets of the 7th Fleet orbited, ready to provide protection to the Marine helicopters. They were not needed, however, as the Viet Cong made no effort to oppose the movement. By mid-afternoon, the airlift of HMM 362's personnel and equipment to the Soc Trang airfield had been completed. HMM 261 returned to the Princeton, where it continued to function as the helicopter element of the Special Landing Force. The day after arriving at Soc Trang, Lieutenant Colonel Clapp's squadron, nicknamed Archie's Angels, was prepared to support the ARVN. Since the squadron's combat support was not required immediately, the pilots and crews began flying missions to familiarize themselves with their new surroundings. They learned that their operations were to be conducted over the vast expanse of South Vietnam, which stretched from just north and east of Saigon to the nation's southernmost tip, the Ca Mau Peninsula, and from the South China Sea westward to the Cambodian border. Their initial flights over the Mekong Delta revealed a predominantly flat and monotonous landscape. Parched by the long dry season, the dusty brown rice paddies stood in sharp contrast with the verdant mangrove swamps which abounded near major streams and along the coast. Numerous hamlets, most enclosed by dense hedgerows and tree lines, were scattered across the countryside. Thousands of canals and trails and a few crude roads completed the rural landscape in which the Viet Cong guerrilla thrived. Larger towns, such as Soc Trang, Can Tho, located about 80 miles southwest of Saigon, and Mai Tho, located about halfway between the capital and Can Tho, were under the control of the government of Vietnam. While the pilots and crews of HMM 362 were acquainting themselves with the geography of the Mekong Delta, Colonel Carey and his staff met in Saigon with U.S. and Vietnamese officers from the MAC-V and 3 Corps headquarters. There, they established liaison with the 3 ARVN divisions subordinate to General Nguyen's 3 Corps, the 21st, the 7th, and the 5th, and discussed operational matters. After several conferences, the final details of the command arrangements were completed. It was agreed that all Marine missions would require the approval of MAC-V, 3 Corps, and the Task Unit Commander. This arrangement would enable General Harkin's command to retain actual operational control of the Marine helicopters, even though they would be supporting 3 Corps exclusively. Final approval of all mission requests for Marine support would rest with the Joint Operations Center, JOC, at JGS headquarters in Saigon. Manned by U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, ARVN, and VNAF officers, this agency was part of a recently instituted tactical air support system, the purpose of which was to provide positive control over all military aircraft in South Vietnam. To ensure maximum coordination at lower echelons, Marine liaison officers were assigned to the Corps headquarters and to the 21st ARVN Division. It was anticipated that this division, headquartered at Can Tho, only 35 miles northwest of Soc Trang, would require more Marine helicopter support than the other divisions that were operating within the Corps tactical zone. While operational planning was underway, the MABS, 16 Marines, set about to improve the newly occupied compound. 2 diesel-powered generators were put into operation and began furnishing electrical power for the camp. The utilities section, which maintained the generators, then began installing electrical wiring throughout the compound. Toilet and shower facilities were constructed to accommodate the Marines. Measures were also taken during this interlude to strengthen the airfield's defenses. Expecting that the Viet Cong might attempt to infiltrate the Marine position, Colonel Carey created a 40-man security unit to protect the inner camp and flight lines. This unit, composed of men from MABS 46 and HMM 362, and responsible to a permanent sergeant of the guard, maintained roving patrols and security posts during hours of darkness. A network of concertina wire, trip flares, and machine gun emplacements provided additional protection around the helicopters and living area. Attack alerts were conducted periodically to coordinate the ARVN's outer defenses and the Marine Guard within the perimeter. Within less than 2 weeks after the first Marines had arrived at Soc Trang, the camp had been adequately prepared to support sustained combat helicopter operations. In addition, defenses had been established and the lines of logistical support from MAC-V had been opened. Food and water were readily available. All necessary liaison with the Vietnamese units to be supported had been accomplished. Pilots and crews had gained a rudimentary knowledge of the area in which they would fly, and Shufly's entire command structure had undergone a 1-week shakedown in which it had proven sound. Mekong Delta Combat Support Operations. Lieutenant Colonel Clapp's squadron began combat operations on Easter Sunday, 22nd April, exactly 1 week after arriving in the Republic of Vietnam. The unit's first combat assignment was to assist the Army's Saigon-based 57th Helicopter Company in an operation codenamed Lockjaw. The American helicopters were to support the ARVN 7th Division, which was headquartered at My Tho, 53 miles northeast of Soc Trang. The Marine helicopters, which departed Soc Trang at 0900, flew 29 sorties and lifted 400 Vietnamese soldiers without incident during the course of their first operation. Unlike the U.S. Army helicopters already operating in other parts of South Vietnam, the Marine Who's Heroes were not armed with machine guns during their initial operations from Soc Trang. Prior to their deployment, the Marine commanders had reasoned that weapons mounted in the cargo hatch would hinder loading and unloading during critical periods while the helicopters were in landing zones. Additionally, armed aircraft would tend to present a more hostile appearance to Vietnamese civilians, thereby providing the Viet Cong ready-made material for their anti-American propaganda themes. The only weapons on board the helicopters, therefore, were the individual sidearms and 2 M3A1 .45 caliber submachine guns carried by the crew members. The automatic weapons enabled Lieutenant Colonel Clapp's men to return fire at short ranges and would also enhance their survival capabilities in the event an aircraft was forced down in unsecure territory. By the summer, the new lightweight AR-15, the forerunner of the M16, would replace the M3A1 grease guns. Near the end of the year, however, the Leatherneck crews were carrying M14 rifles, the standard U.S. 7.62 mm infantry weapon of this period. Once HMM 362 began combat flight operations, the tempo of activities at Soc Trang quickened. The same day that Shufly helicopters participated in the coordinated helilift from Mito, and Hughes was called upon to evacuate an American advisor from Vinh Long, 46 miles north of Soc Trang. The following day, the first combined operation involving Vietnamese Marine ground forces and U.S. Marine helicopters was conducted. A company of Vietnamese Marines was helilifted into a threatened government outpost south of the town of Ca Mau, located near the southern tip of South Vietnam, to provide security while HMM 362's helicopters evacuated the 57-man garrison. On 24 April, 16 Marine helicopters supported the 21st ARVN Division in Operation Nightingale, conducted near Can Tho. In this operation, 591 ARVN troops were lifted into 8 landing zones along 2 canals where a large group of Viet Cong had been reported. Shortly after the first wave of the assault force landed, a vicious small arms fight erupted. HMM 362 suffered its first combat damage when a helicopter was forced down after its oil line was punctured by enemy fire. An accompanying Hughes quickly landed and retrieved the crew. 4 other helicopters proceeded to the forward loading site, picked up a Marine repair team and enough ARVN troops to protect the team while it worked, and returned to the downed aircraft. The mechanics completed their repairs in 2 hours, after which the crew returned the helicopter to Soc Trang. The security force was then lifted out of the area. Despite the damage suffered by the Marine aircraft, the Can Tho operation apparently achieved some success. The Viet Cong reportedly suffered 70 dead and lost 3 prisoners to the South Vietnamese, while the ARVN units lost only 3 killed and 6 wounded. The Marines of HMM 362, moreover, had responded to a new challenge by demonstrating that they could recover helicopters which had been forced to land in insecure territory. Although the principle of providing security while accomplishing field repairs had been employed previously by the Army helicopter companies, the Can Tho operation of 24 April marked the first time the Marines had been required to use the technique. HMM 362 again joined the Army's 57th Helicopter Company for a coordinated troop lift on 25 April. This time, the objective was the small town of Chau Do on the Bassac River near the Cambodian border, which had been raided and burned by a force whose identity was undetermined. 14 Marine helicopters transported 168 troops from the 21st ARVN Division to the scene of the incident, while 2 other squadron aircraft lifted the deputy commander of 3 Corps, the 21st Division commander, and the senior U.S. advisor in 3 Corps, Colonel Daniel B. Potter, Jr., U.S. Army, to the village. The landing was uncontested as the marauding band had fled across the international border into Cambodia. The conditions which confronted HMM 362 in the Mekong Delta during its first weeks of combat operations encouraged the squadron's pilots to experiment with new tactics. One such instance occurred in the first week of May in Ba Xuyen Province, when the province chief requested that the Marine helicopters support his Civil Guard company in a raid on a fortified Viet Cong village about 12 miles southwest of Soc Trang. Because the objective was located so near the Soc Trang airfield, Lieutenant Colonel Clapp ordered an unusual technique used for approaching the landing zone. The flight would rendezvous over Soc Trang at treetop level and proceed to the objective with the flight leader slightly to the rear and above the formation. From this vantage point, the flight leader could keep the other aircraft in sight and exercise better control over each element of the flight. The success of the new procedure led Lieutenant Colonel Clapp to remark later that the technique was similar to calling the plays from the grandstand. It became another tactic available for the squadron's future use. In terms of lessons learned, HMM 362's most significant operation during its initial month of combat support came on 9 May. 23 helicopters and 2 OE-1 observation aircraft launched from Ka Mau at 1100 for an assault on Kai Nai, a Viet Cong-controlled village 21 miles to the south. At 1200, the helicopters began landing the ARVN troops in 6 landing zones which had been attacked only 5 minutes earlier by Vietnamese Air Force fighter bombers. Firing broke out even before the Vietnamese troops could jump from the helicopters. During this clash, 8 of the Marine aircraft were hit by small arms fire, and 2 Vietnamese troops were wounded while still on board. One HUS, struck in the oil return line, was forced to land a few miles from the objective. Troops were flown in quickly to establish a perimeter around the downed aircraft while repairs were made. After the temporary repairs had been completed, its crew flew the helicopter to Ka Mau, where it remained until more extensive work could be accomplished. The other aircraft, including an OE-1, suffered only superficial damage and continued to support the ARVN operation. From this encounter with the Viet Cong, the Marine pilots learned that airstrikes conducted just prior to a helicopter landing in the heavily populated Delta country tended to disclose the location of the landing zone to the enemy. In this instance, the Communists had been able to reach the landing zone in the few minutes which elapsed between the last airstrike and the arrival of the Marine helicopters. Following this experience, the Marines would no longer allow VNAF airstrikes on landing zones prior to operations in the Flat Delta region. The Americans and Vietnamese, however, soon learned to use fixed-wing aircraft to support helicopter operations in another manner. By mid-June, Farmgate T-28 Trojans, a single-engine, 2-seat trainer built by North American, modified to carry bombs, rockets, and machine guns, were flying escort missions for the Marine Helicopter Squadron. This particular aircraft could fly slowly enough to cruise with the HUS, yet fast enough to deliver an airstrike en route to the objective and then catch up with the helicopter formation. Normally, an element of 2 T-28s accompanied the helicopters and were used primarily to attack targets near the landing zone after the ARVN troops were on the ground. The placement of an American pilot instructor and a Vietnamese student in the T-28, a requirement imposed by MACV, helped avert language problems which invariably developed when coordinating ARVN ground operations and U.S. air operations. The effectiveness of the escort tactic increased as the Marine and Air Force pilots became accustomed to planning, coordinating, and executing the missions. The Marines quickly learned the value of utilizing the OE-1 in conjunction with their helicopter operations. 3 single-engine, 2-man aircraft, a detachment from Marine Observation Squadron 2, VMO-2, proved remarkably versatile in day-to-day operations over the Delta. Primarily, they were used in daylight visual reconnaissance, usually to study objective areas and the approach routes which the helicopters would later use. Sometimes their crews were called upon to photograph proposed landing zones for briefing purposes. Often the aircraft's radios were used to relay messages between various ARVN ground units which were operating beyond the range of their radios. Equipped with 2 frequency-modulated FM radios for work with ground stations and 1 ultra-high-frequency UHF radio for communicating with other aircraft, The OE-1 was perfectly suited for controlling helicopter landings. The Marine aviators also found that, unlike their helicopters, the observation aircraft did not arouse suspicion in the area over which it flew. This advantage was due probably to several factors. First, the Vietnamese Air Force, VNAF, routinely operated similar aircraft over the entire region. Secondly, the enemy could not readily determine whether the OE-1 was on a reconnaissance mission or merely flying from one point to another. And finally, the small aircraft made little noise. Given these characteristics, it was no accident that the helicopter squadron relied on the observation aircraft more and more as the pattern of operations unfolded. Shortly after their arrival in Vietnam, the Marines of HMM 362 began experimenting with one of the more imaginative techniques developed in the early stages of the intensified U.S. GVN counterinsurgency effort. Marine air crews had noticed that the enemy often managed to elude the larger ARVN units by fleeing the operations area in small groups. Even the smallest breach between ARVN units seemed to allow large numbers of guerrillas to escape into covered or heavily populated areas where they became impossible to find. Colonel Carey and Lieutenant Colonel Clapp devised a plan to prevent escapes of this nature. Their idea was to have a flight of 4 Marine helicopters loaded with about 50 ARVN soldiers circle above the contested area. This so-called Eagle flight would be on the alert for any Viet Cong attempting to evade the ground forces. Once the enemy was located, often by the OE-1 observation aircraft, the helicopters would land the Vietnamese soldiers at a position where they could block his escape. The Marine commanders felt that the adoption of such a tactic would increase the effectiveness of the ARVN's helicopter assault operations. After several weeks of planning by HMM 362 and the affected 3rd Corps commands, the concept was put into practice. The Eagle flight was first tested in a large operation on 18 June when HMM 362 heli-lifted ARVN troops into 16 different landing zones. Heavy monsoon rains made the enemy particularly difficult to pin down, but the Marine pilots managed to sight 10 Viet Cong near the main landing zone. After landing near the enemy, the ARVN troops captured 10 communist soldiers and wounded 1 other. Shortly after this incident, another Eagle flight made 2 eventful contacts with the enemy. The Marine helicopters landed their small force, and the ARVN promptly killed 4 Viet Cong and captured another. 20 minutes later, after reboarding the helicopters, the South Vietnamese swept down upon a new prey, this time capturing 4 prisoners. The novel concept was employed successfully again on 10 July. While HMM 362 aircraft lifted 968 ARVN troops into the Ca Mau area, an Eagle flight spotted a sampan moving northward from the operations area. The flight leader landed the troops nearby, and the ARVN intercepted the craft. Later that day, the Marines and ARVN of the Eagle flight clashed twice with an estimated platoon of Viet Cong. In the first encounter, 7 enemy were killed and several weapons were captured. In the second skirmish, the enemy suffered 6 dead and lost more weapons. All 4 Marine helicopters, however, were hit by small arms fire during the 2 brief fights. By the middle of July, the Eagle flight had become a proven combat tactic. By reducing the enemy's opportunity to escape when the government forces possessed the advantage on the battlefield, it had favorably influenced the tactical situation when used in the Mekong Delta. Equally important, Shufly's commanders had demonstrated their ability to adapt their technological resources to the Viet Cong's methods of operations. Variants of the Eagle flight tactic under different names such as Tiger Flight, Sparrowhawk, Pacifier, and quick reaction force would be used by the Marines throughout the Vietnam War. The Marines were quick to apply their technological know-how to other problems which were to confront them during their early operations in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone. One example was their adaptation of the TAFDS to the problem which arose when the helicopters were called upon to operate far beyond their normal fuel range. HMM 362 helicopters would airlift a TAFDS unit, complete with a 10,000-gallon fuel bladder, pumps, and MABS-16 personnel, to the site where the ARVN troops were to be loaded. The fuel bladders were filled by gasoline trucks which traveled from the nearest source of fuel. The Marine helicopters could then use the TAFDS as a temporary base of operations, refueling between troop pickups when necessary. Thus employed, the TAFDS allowed the operating radius of the helicopters to be extended to support even the most distant South Vietnamese operation. While the Marines were learning to adapt their technology to the guerrilla war environment, the enemy was applying his ingenuity in attempts to frustrate the American and South Vietnamese helicopter operations. The Viet Cong quickly learned to capitalize on the presence of large crowds of civilians who sometimes gathered near helicopter landing zones to watch the strange aircraft. One such incident occurred in June when communist soldiers mingled with a crowd and delivered fire on helicopters which were lifting elements of the 21st ARVN Division. 2 aircraft were hit by enemy fire, although the damage was not extensive enough to force them to land. The Marines, who refused to return fire with their individual weapons unless the Viet Cong could be separated from the civilian populace, found no effective method of countering this tactic. Later in June, the Marines of HMM 362 encountered another tactic when they found that hundreds of upright bamboo stakes had been pre-positioned in the intended landing zone. The perpendicular spikes, each 4 or 5 feet high, not only prevented the helicopters from landing, but also made it impossible to disembark the ARVN troops while hovering. Fortunately, the abundance of landing zones in the Delta region tended to make this particular tactic ineffective. The German Army had used a similar technique, upright poles, to obstruct landing zones against U.S. paratroops at Normandy during World War II. On 20th July, HMM 362 added a new dimension to the counter-guerrilla capabilities of the South Vietnamese forces when it executed the first night helicopter assault of the war. The mission, which began at 04:15 at Soc Trang, involved lifting 3 waves of ARVN troops into an objective on the Plain of Reeds, about 40 miles southwest of Ben Tre. The ARVN force intended to encircle a suspected Viet Cong village before dawn and then attack it at daybreak. The Marine portion of the airlift was completed 10 minutes before daylight, after which the Army's 57th Helicopter Company joined the operation. Although the night troop lift was executed without incident, Lieutenant Colonel Clapp attributed its success at least partially to the near-perfect conditions. The moonlight, reflected from the flat, flooded rice paddies, had aided the Marine pilots in the tricky operation. Prior to Shufly's deployment to Soc Trang, General Roberts' staff at FMFPAC had developed a policy for the periodic rotation of the task unit's Marines for which the Commandant's approval had been gained. The helicopter squadron would be replaced by a similar unit after approximately 4 months of operations in the combat zone. But rather than being drawn from the 1st MAW on Okinawa, the replacement squadron was to be provided by the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing in California. Officers and men serving with the supporting headquarters and MABs, 16 elements, however, were to be replaced by Marines from MAG, 16, at approximately 4-month intervals. So as not to disrupt the operational efficiency of the task unit, individual replacements would be made in increments. In accordance with this rotation policy, HMM-163, the Huss unit scheduled to relieve HMM-362, began arriving at Soc Trang on 23 July. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Rathbun, a veteran fighter pilot of World War II and Korea, the squadron continued to arrive during the last week of July. Airlifted by GVLs from the Marine Corps Air Facility, Santa Ana, California, the new squadron brought neither helicopters nor maintenance equipment. The squadron commander had orders to continue operations with HMM-362's aircraft and equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Clapp's squadron maintained a steady operational pace even after the new unit's appearance. On 27 July, 18 of HMM-362's helicopters participated in an operation about 30 miles northeast of Soc Trang. The next day, the task unit commander committed 21 helicopters and OELS to a 21st ARVN Division operation near Ca Mau. The Eagle flight was committed on 4 different occasions during this operation. Lieutenant Colonel Rathbun's Ridge Runners officially relieved Archie's Angels on 1 August after a week of orientation flying with HMM-362's crews. The men of the departing squadron could reflect on their tour in South Vietnam with a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. Since their arrival in mid-April, they had executed 50 combat helicopter assaults, had flown 4,439 sorties, and had amassed 5,262 hours of combat flight time, all in unarmed aircraft. During the course of these missions, they had made approximately 130 different landings against Viet Cong opposition. 17 of their 24 helicopters and 2 of the 3 OE-1 aircraft had received battle damage. To the credit of the squadron's maintenance personnel and air crews, HMM-362 had not lost a single aircraft during its operations in the Republic of Vietnam. Miraculously, the squadron had suffered no casualties while testing the Marine Corps' vertical envelopment concept in the guerrilla war situation. During their 3.5 months at Soc Trang, Lieutenant Colonel Clapp's men had contributed significantly to another facet of the war effort, one usually considered unrelated to normal combat operations. Sensing the unique links between the political and military aspects of the struggle in South Vietnam, Colonel Carey had initiated a people-to-people program, the objective of which was to assist the government of Vietnam in winning the allegiance of the Vietnamese people. Within a few days after occupying the Soc Trang airfield, Colonel Carey had ordered the task unit's medical facilities made available to Vietnamese civilians requiring emergency medical treatment. U.S. Navy doctors and corpsmen began visiting nearby villages to hold sick call for the local inhabitants. On an average visit, these medical teams would examine around 60 Vietnamese of all ages. They would then dispense soap, vitamins, and aspirin, commodities which some rural Vietnamese had never seen. Gradually, the medical teams expanded their operations until by mid-June they were being flown by helicopter as far away as Ca Mau. N-362's departure from Vietnam coincided roughly with the departure of most of the Marine Task Unit's senior officers, the men who had directed the efforts to win the other war for the allegiance of the Vietnamese people. On 30 July, Colonel Julius W. Ireland, another Marine aviator who had seen combat in 2 previous wars, relieved Colonel Carey as the task unit commander. The new commander was one of few Marines who had been in Vietnam previously. In April 1954, he had landed at Da Nang, then known by its French name, Tehran, as squadron commander of Marine Attack Squadron 324, the MA-324. And delivered 25 F-4U FG Corsair fighter bombers to the French, who were in desperate need of attack aircraft to support Dien Bien Phu. 5 days after Ireland assumed command of Task Unit 79.3.5, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph R. Davis replaced Lieutenant Colonel Eldridge as commanding officer of the MABS-16 subunit. On 13 August, another change occurred when the executive officer of the Marine Task Unit, Lieutenant Colonel Harry C. Dees, was relieved by Lieutenant Colonel Alton W. McCulley. Except that it left few original members of the task unit, the departure of these Marines for new duty stations in Okinawa, Japan, and the United States did not affect the operations at Soc Trang. Thoroughly briefed on their responsibilities, the new officers would continue to direct Marine support of the Vietnamese government on both the battlefield and the psychological front. HIM 163 participated in its first combat mission as a squadron on 1 August, when it joined the Army's 57th Helicopter Company in a coordinated troop lift. Like their predecessors, Rathbun's Ridge Runners maintained a brisk pace of operations during the weeks following their initial assignment. Shortly after its first troop lift, the squadron participated in a 2,000-man South Vietnamese spoiling operation in An Xuyen, South Vietnam's southernmost province. Anticipating a major Viet Cong offensive in the 4 southern provinces, Third Corps authorities moved their headquarters to Soc Trang and established a forward command post at Ca Mau. The Vietnamese Air Force then positioned a composite detachment of 4 AD-6 Sky Raiders, single-engine, propeller-driven attack bombers built by Douglas, 2 T-28s, and a number of H-34 helicopters. The U.S. Army, Air Force, and VNAF version of the HUS at Soc Trang to support the operation. Joined by the VNAF H-34s, the Marine Squadron conducted numerous troop lifts during the week-long operation. At the end of the action, the ARVN reported 84 Viet Cong killed, another 30 captured, and the confiscation of nearly 15,000 pounds of arms, ammunition, and explosives. The first Marine helicopter loss in Vietnam occurred during the operation, when a VNAF fighter careened off the runway and damaged a parked HUS to the extent that it could not be repaired. Marine mechanics stripped undamaged parts from the helicopter for use as replacements. 163 suffered its first aircraft damage as a result of combat a few days later, on 18 August, during a mission led by Lieutenant Colonel Rathbun. 14 HUSs arrived at a prearranged pickup point to rendezvous with an ARVN infantry force, but the Marine pilots discovered that the unit had not appeared. One crewman then reported having seen some ARVN troops about a half-mile away from the landing zone. At this juncture, a white smoke signal appeared at approximately the same location that the Marine had observed the South Vietnamese troops. Lieutenant Colonel Rathbun and his wingmate, assuming that the smoke marked the actual pickup point, took off to investigate the area. While making a low pass over the smoke signal, the squadron commander's helicopter was hit several times by small arms fire, which severed the rudder control cable and punctured the main rotor transmission. The loss of oil required Rathbun to make a forced landing on a nearby road. After mechanics had been flown in and repairs had been accomplished, the helicopter was flown to a secure area. An investigation of the incident later revealed that the confusion had begun when the ARVN unit scheduled to be heli-lifted became involved in a skirmish with guerrillas less than a mile from the pickup point. A VNAF Forward Air Controller, FAC, in an observation aircraft had then marked the Viet Cong position for an airstrike with a white smoke grenade rather than red smoke, as was normally used. This was the smoke which Lieutenant Colonel Rathbun had attempted to identify when his aircraft was hit. From this incident, the pilots of HMM 163 learned several valuable lessons about helicopter support in conjunction with ARVN ground operations. First, helilifts of government forces from the field at prearranged times required thorough, last-minute coordination. Secondly, helicopters could not be used safely on low-level reconnaissance or identification passes. Finally, prearranged colored smoke signals were easily confused and when used routinely were subject to enemy attempts at deception. Such signaling methods were most effective when used in conjunction with radio communications between air and ground units. A somewhat humorous sequel to this incident took place later in the day when Rathbun learned that he had been selected for promotion to colonel. The timing of the notification prompted one squadron wit to quip, "Lost a bird, gained a bird." Rathbun's Ridge Runners continued intensive support operations in 3rd Corps Tactical Zone throughout the month of August. Their daily missions normally included both scheduled troop lifts and unscheduled medical evacuations. During the week of 19-25 August, HMM-163 helicopters logged slightly over 800 combat flying hours. A squadron record for a single day was established on 24 August, when 197.6 helicopter hours were flown. Flight time for the helicopters during the entire month totaled 2,543 hours, a new Marine Corps record for an HUS squadron. The OE-1 aircraft added 63 missions and 212 hours to this total. Another statistic revealed that 21 of the squadron's pilots logged over 100 hours of combat flying time during August. This record was even more impressive considering that flight operations were hampered by the monsoon season, which reached its peak during August in the Mekong Delta. In August, Lieutenant Colonel Rathbun's men made a significant modification to their helicopters when they began mounting M60 machine guns inside the cargo hatch. So as not to obstruct the hatch during loading and unloading phases, the squadron's metalsmiths designed a flexible mount which allowed the crew chiefs to swing the belt-fed 7.52 mm automatic weapon back into the cabin when necessary. The addition of the machine gun enabled the crew chief to protect the otherwise defenseless helicopter during critical landing and takeoff phases. Still, the Marine gunners were restricted in their action by MACV's Rules of Engagement, which at this time stipulated that American servicemen could fire only after being fired upon, and then only at clearly identified enemy. Intended to prevent offensive combat action by U.S. military personnel operating in Vietnam, these regulations prevented Americans from returning fire except when the enemy was clearly identified. Primarily because of these restrictions, the Marines seldom employed their M60s in the heavily populated Mekong Delta. Preparations and redeployment. In early September, General Harkins directed that Colonel Ireland begin planning for the redeployment of his helicopter task unit northward to Da Nang. The shift to 1st Corps, which had been the subject of much debate prior to Shufly's assignment at Soc Trang, came as no surprise. Shortly after the task unit's arrival in the Mekong Delta, Colonel Carey accompanied General Condon on a visit to the Army's 93rd Helicopter Company at Da Nang. There, they discussed details of the relocation with Army officers. In early July, General Harkins set 1st August as the date on which the Marine Task Unit and the 93rd Helicopter Company would switch locations. But personal appeals by General Neum, the 3rd Corps commander, and his senior U.S. advisor, Colonel Porter, that the Marine helicopters be retained at Soc Trang caused Harkins to postpone the date for the exchange until 15 September. In that the airlift was executed in phases, the Marines' movement to Da Nang was accomplished in much the same manner as had been the task unit's initial move into Soc Trang. On 4 September, Colonel Ireland dispatched the task unit's assistant communications officer and an advance party to Da Nang to assess the communications requirements there and to prepare for the arrival of the remainder of the Marines and their equipment. 4 days later, Marine wiremen, message center personnel, and radio operators began preparing a communications center at their new home. The next day, the advance party established radio contact with Shufly headquarters in order to help coordinate the move. By 9 September, MABS, 16 technicians had assembled a TAFDS at the Da Nang airfield. This facility would enable the GV-1 transports participating in the airlift to refuel for the 460-mile return flight to Soc Trang after unloading their cargoes at Da Nang. While the advance party readied the facilities at Da Nang for its unit's arrival, combat support operations and preparations for the move northward continued simultaneously at Soc Trang. During an operation on 5 September, 3 of HMM-163's helicopters were hit by several rounds of enemy small arms fire. Although all 3 aircraft returned safely to base, the Marines suffered their first casualty to Viet Cong fire when Corporal Billy S. Watson, a crew chief, was slightly wounded. Troop lifts from Soc Trang continued until 1740 on 13 September, when helicopter support operations were ended and the final preparations for the move to Da Nang began. Marine helicopters lost in Vietnam during the 1962-1964 period were replaced by new ones airlifted from Okinawa by U.S. Air Force C-124 Globemaster transports. By replacing aircraft losses on a one-to-one basis, the task unit was able to maintain a level of 24 helicopters except for brief periods. The rules of engagement applied to U.S. advisors as well as aviation crews. Although they underwent several modifications during the course of the war, the above definition was virtually unaltered during the period between 1962 and 1964. On the evening of 14 September, the first of the Marine GV-Ls slated to transport the task unit arrived at Soc Trang from Okinawa. The GV-1, later KC-130, a 4-engine, turboprop refueler transport built by Lockheed, was the Marine refueling version of the Air Force C-130. At dawn the next morning, the refueler transports began shuttling Marines and their equipment to Da Nang and the Army's 93rd Deed Helicopter Company to Soc Trang. By the end of the day, much of the airlift had been completed. The crews and helicopters of Lieutenant Colonel Rathbun's squadron, however, did not begin displacing northward until the 16th, when 12 HUSs made the 7-hour flight to Da Nang with 3 en route refueling stops. The 12 remaining helicopters arrived at Shufly's new base of operations the next day. The move was completed on 20th September when the last cargo-carrying GV-1 landed at Da Nang. Accomplishments at Soc Trang. As Shufly's Marines began preparing for their impending operations in the northern provinces, they could look with pride on their accomplishments at Soc Trang. Since their arrival in the Mekong Delta in April, the Leathernecks had clearly demonstrated their ability to conduct sustained and effective helicopter operations in support of non-English-speaking ground forces. While it could not be said that their presence had completely transformed the complexion of the GVN's struggle to control the critical Mekong Delta region, the Marine helicopters had provided the ARVN units operating there with a degree of mobility they had not previously possessed. This newfound mobility, in turn, had helped generate a new offensive spirit within government units assigned to Southern Third Corps. In his letter to COM US MACV requesting the retention of the task unit at Soc Trang, Colonel Porter, the senior U.S. advisor to the Corps Tactical Zone, reported, "Now the ARVN forces have a taste of victory and for the first time are beginning to believe there is a possibility of defeating the Viet Cong." During the course of their operations throughout South Vietnam's southern provinces, the Shufly Marines displayed an instinct for recognizing and coping with the challenges of unconventional warfare. Confronted by a war without front lines in which an elusive, highly mobile enemy blended readily with the local populace, the task unit's leaders devised new and successful helicopter tactics. Likewise, Shufly's Marine and Navy personnel moved to prevent a possible conflict of cultures and to discredit communist propaganda through the initiation of the People-to-People program. Although only an informal beginning, This program would serve as a foundation upon which the U.S. Marine Corps would later build a doctrine defining the relationship between Marines on duty in Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. Beyond the innovative thinking of its leaders, much of Shufly's success in Third Corps was produced by hard work on a sustained basis. For this, the individual Marines, particularly the maintenance crews which often worked around the clock in primitive surroundings to keep the helicopters airworthy, deserved heavy credit. Although unglamorous, their daily contributions underwrote the success of the combat support operations. So, functioning as a team, the task unit's members blended innovation, hard work, and technical expertise with perseverance and courage to carve out a reputation for themselves in the faraway rice lands of the Mekong Delta.